There comes a moment in every soul's journey where suffering no longer seeks a remedy, but a revelation. What if I told you that the very pain you flee from is the secret doorway through which your soul longs to enter? When emotional pain descends upon us, the natural instinct is to resist, to silence it, to flee into distraction, to numb it with pleasures or drown it in toil. But in truth, pain is not the enemy. It is the summons of the soul, a sacred disturbance that arises when we have strayed too far from our inner essence. The soul speaks not in the language of logic or routine, but in symbols, in dreams, and yes, often in suffering. What most call agony is, in its deepest sense, the soul's lament that its needs have gone unheard. I have seen many patients, men and women alike, who arrived in my study weary from years of external success yet internally starving. One man, a financier of great repute, was seized by sudden despair when he realized he had climbed a ladder propped against the wrong wall. His anguish was not a flaw to be fixed, it was his soul demanding a return to meaning. And so I told him what I tell you now. Do not silence your suffering, for it is sacred. It is the crucible in which your true self seeks to be reborn. As Heraclitus once said, character is fate. And I would add, our refusal to face the pain that forms our character is what traps us in cycles of repetition. The one who numbs the ache without listening to its message will find it returns, again and again, cloaked in new disguises, relationships that fail, wealth that feels hollow, health that decays without cause. The spiritual truth, then, is this: emotional pain is the soul's way of breaking through the walls of the false self. It is not here to punish you, but to awaken you. Each pang is a signpost pointing toward something unlived, unloved, or unintegrated. And only when we turn inward with courage and reverence do we begin the alchemical process of transformation. So do not curse your pain. Sit with it, listen. Let it guide you back to the place you abandoned within. We often imagine that the avoidance of pain is a form of strength, a triumph of will over weakness. But this illusion is the birthplace of true suffering. Pain in its natural form is a fleeting messenger, a signal, a flicker of imbalance, a sacred tremor from the soul. Yet it is our resistance, our desperate attempts to deny, suppress, or outrun it, that mutates pain into prolonged agony. What we resist persists, and what we fear to feel will command our fate from the shadows. I once sat with a woman who had buried her grief beneath a mask of composure for decades. Her father had passed when she was young, but she was told to be strong, and so she never cried. She grew into a dutiful adult, a caretaker for all. But her body bore the silent rebellion: migraines, chronic fatigue, a hollowness she could not name. It was not the original pain that broke her. It was the long resistance to it. When at last she wept in my study, her tears were not of weakness but of healing, for in that moment she ceased to resist and instead embraced the wound. Seneca said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And how true it is, for the mind that resists pain will construct entire labyrinths of fear, shame, and despair. It will bind itself in chains forged from what-ifs and self-condemnation. But when we allow pain to simply be without judgment, without armor, it begins to soften. It teaches. It transforms. Think of it like a storm pressing against a closed door. The more tightly you hold it shut, the more pressure builds, until eventually the door shatters. But if you open it, let the wind in. Let it rage and pass, you remain intact. In that surrender, there is wisdom. In that acceptance, there is peace. So let us stop fleeing from pain as if it were the enemy. It is not. It is our resistance that must be surrendered. For only then can the storm become a teacher rather than a tormentor. There is a part within us that we dare not look at: the rejected, the shamed, the feared. This is the shadow. We spend much of our lives running from it, projecting it onto others, disguising it with virtue or busyness. Yet, what we fail to realize is that the very parts we exile hold the keys to our liberation. It is not in the light that we grow whole, but in the sacred work of descending into the depths and reclaiming what we have disowned. In my early work with patients, I observed how their neuroses often stemmed not from what they consciously did, but from what they repressed. A man consumed by anger feared his own vulnerability. A woman obsessed with control feared the chaos of her untamed emotions. In both cases, it was their refusal to meet their shadow that kept them bound in cycles of pain. When they finally turned inward, not with condemnation, But with curiosity they began to discover that what they feared most was not evil, but unlived potential. The ancient Greeks understood this paradox well. They honored the underworld not as a place of punishment, but as a domain of hidden truths. Know thyself was carved into the temple of Apollo, not as a mere philosophical suggestion, but as a spiritual necessity. And to know oneself fully, one must be willing to confront what lies beneath the mask. I myself was not spared from this descent. I remember a time when my own pride, my attachment to being the wise physician, blinded me to my arrogance. It was only through confronting the pain of my own fallibility that I could access true humility. That humility did not diminish me. It freed me. For in accepting the darkness, I was no longer ruled by it. Do not be afraid of the shadow. It is not your enemy, it is the part of you that longs for recognition, the part that carries the fire of transformation. To integrate it is not to become perfect, but to become whole. And in that wholeness, the cycle of emotional pain begins to break, not by avoiding the darkness, but by walking through it with open eyes. We see in others not who they are, but who we are too afraid to acknowledge within ourselves. What we reject in the depths of our own psyche, we unconsciously hurl outward onto strangers, lovers, enemies, and even onto God. This is projection, the grand illusion that spares us the pain of inner reckoning, yet traps us in cycles of false judgment and emotional torment. We are hurt, not always because of what others do, but because we look at them through the fractured lens of our own unhealed wounds. I once worked with a man who was tormented by the idea that others were constantly criticizing him. No matter how many reassurances he received, his reality remained tinted with suspicion. Beneath his fear of judgment lay an inner voice of self-condemnation, harsh, ancient, and buried. It was not the world that hated him. It was a piece of his own soul, split off in childhood and left behind in shame. Only when he turned within to embrace this forgotten part, did the outer world begin to lose its oppressive hold. We all carry within us these ghosts, memories we dare not revisit, aspects we feel are unworthy of love, and when we disown them, they do not disappear, they simply change form. They become the arrogance we despise in others, the coldness we accuse our lovers of, the greed we see in the world. But if we are willing to trace the thread inward, if we ask not, why is he like that, but why does this affect me so deeply, we begin the sacred work of reclaiming what is ours. Plotinus once wrote, "Withdraw into yourself and look, and if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful." This withdrawal, this turning inward, is the beginning of healing. The end of projection is not detachment, but responsibility. It is the humble realization that the outer world is not to blame, it is the mirror in which our soul seeks to be seen. And only when we recognize our reflection can we truly begin to love, not just others, but ourselves. The persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear before the world, is born not from truth, but from necessity. It is the social skin that helps us belong, be loved, admired, or simply survive. Yet what we forget is that the more tightly we fasten this mask to our face, the more estranged we become from the soul behind it. We are taught to become someone successful, good, agreeable, admirable, but in that becoming, we often abandon who we truly are. And so begins the quiet ache within, the emotional pain that whispers, something is missing. I have seen many individuals suffer not because of outward misfortune, but because they were living out a version of themselves, sculpted by the expectations of others. A man celebrated as a leader, yet inwardly riddled with despair, because his every triumph was built upon denying his deepest longing for a quieter, simpler life. A woman praised for her kindness, yet secretly suffocating under the weight of always pleasing others. Their persona, beloved by society, was their prison. The persona is a necessary bridge between the self and society, but it must never become a wall between the self and the soul. When pain arises, we often try to fix the mask, become more efficient, more attractive, more agreeable, but emotional pain is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a signal, a cry from the soul saying, "This is not who I am." The end of the persona is not the end of functioning in the world. It is the beginning of living truthfully. The ancient oracle of Delphi declared, "Know thyself." But we cannot know ourselves if we are busy being who we think others want us to be. True healing begins when we dare to peel away the mask, to confront what lies beneath our fears, our desires, our wounds, and to accept them without shame. In that rawness, in that terrifying authenticity, something sacred happens. The soul begins to breathe again, and in its breath we find peace. It is often in the very place we feel most broken that the soul begins to stir. The wound, the psychic tear we strive to avoid, deny or bury is not merely a source of anguish. It is the holy aperture through which the light of truth, transformation, and self-realization enters. And yet our instinct is to run from it, to seal it shut, to pretend it never existed. But what we conceal festers. What we confront, we transmute. I recall a man who came to me shattered by betrayal. His life had been built on trust, loyalty, and devotion until the very foundations cracked. At first he wished only to forget, to numb the pain. But as we journeyed together into the heart of that wound, what emerged was not merely sorrow, it was buried wisdom. He discovered in the betrayal a mirror. He had long betrayed himself by sacrificing his voice for peace, his needs for others' comfort. The betrayal outside had awakened the betrayal within, and that awareness, painful though it was, became the threshold to a new beginning. Persian mystic Rumi once wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." This is no poetic exaggeration, it is a psychological reality. That which shatters us also opens us. The ego resists this revelation because it thrives on control, protection, and identity. But the soul is not concerned with preservation. It seeks expansion, and often that expansion requires a breaking. We must understand to be wounded is not to be weak. It is to be alive. It is to have dared to feel deeply, to have risked connection, love, or purpose. And though we may curse the pain, it is in walking through it without turning away that we discover the inner alchemist, the divine force that turns anguish into awakening. So do not rush to heal too quickly, nor cover the wound with distraction or pretense. Sit with it, listen, let it speak. For within it lies the path not just to healing, but to wholeness. And when the light pours in, you will not be who you were before, you will be something far more real. Modern man has perfected the art of distraction. We bury our wounds beneath accomplishments, numb our grief with busyness, and veil our deepest sorrows in smiles we no longer believe. But the soul has its own rhythm, its own demands, and one of its laws is this: you cannot heal what you refuse to feel. Emotional pain, when ignored, becomes the architect of inner decay. It festers in the unseen corners of the psyche, shaping our decisions, tainting our relationships, and whispering falsehoods into the ear of our worth. I once worked with a woman who had endured the early death of her child. Rather than collapse beneath the weight of this tragedy, she soldiered on, resumed work, even comforted others, becoming the very pillar of strength. Society applauds, but underneath the unwept grief turned to a quiet rage, manifesting in unexplained ailments and a deep, hollow disconnection from life. It was not until she allowed herself to feel, to scream, weep, curse the heavens that the healing could begin. Her sorrow, once suppressed, transformed into something sacred, a renewed relationship with life, with death, and with herself. Feeling is not weakness. It is the instrument through which the unconscious becomes conscious. As Sophocles said, nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. But feeling that curse, grieving it, trembling under its shadow is the price of wisdom. The soul does not demand perfection. It demands presence. It does not require that we fix every fracture, but that we remain with it long enough to hear what the pain is truly saying. Avoidance, denial, rationalization, these are the ego's defenses. But the soul speaks in sensation, in dream, in ache. And if we have the courage to descend into those depths, to truly feel what frightens us, we find that feeling itself is the balm. It is the bridge between wound and wisdom. So do not flee your pain. Welcome it as a guide, for it is only through feeling that we open the door to healing. And through that door, the soul returns to its rightful place at the center of our being. There comes a moment often cloaked in darkness, confusion, or unbearable pain when one begins to sense that life is not merely a sequence of events, but a summons. This call is not to conformity nor to achievement, but to a radical becoming. Individuation is this summons. It is the soul's perilous journey through the fire, not to be made perfect, but to be made whole. And this fire burns away all that is false, the borrowed beliefs, the imposed values, the roles we wear like armor to guard the vulnerable truth beneath. It is not a path for the faint of heart, for it demands that we relinquish the comfort of the known and walk into the wilderness of the psyche. I have witnessed men who built empires, only to feel an unbearable emptiness echoing inside them. Their pain was not a flaw, but an invitation, the soul knocking from within. One, a man of great intellect, came to me having lost all appetite for life. He had mastered the external world, but his inner world was barren. As we traced the roots of his discontent, he confronted the parts of himself he had long denied his tenderness, his fear, his longing for meaning. In facing these inner fires, he began to forge a self that was no longer split, no longer pretending. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is self-encounter. It is, as Heraclitus once said, character is destiny. The more we become who we are at the core, not who we are told to be, the more we align with the deep architecture of the soul, and that process is alchemical. It requires the dissolution of the ego, the confrontation with the shadow, and the integration of opposites. Pain is the heat of transformation. Without it, there is no fire to transmute base metal into gold. The cycle of emotional pain continues only when we resist this fire, when we cling to personas and comforts that no longer serve our evolution. But when we surrender to it, when we allow ourselves to be reshaped by the flames, we emerge not as ashes but as essence. And that is the soul's true victory, not escape, but embodiment. There is a great illusion that grips the suffering soul. The belief that one's pain is a solitary burden, uniquely cursed, unfairly inflicted. This belief isolates the individual, cloaks him in shame, and blinds him to the deeper truth that pain is not personal. It is archetypal. It is the echo of humanity's ancient wounds, reverberating through the corridors of the individual psyche. Each heartbreak, betrayal, or abandonment we endure is not merely our own. It is a thread woven into the great mythic tapestry of existence. When we grieve, we do not grieve alone. We step into the current of a timeless river, in which all who have ever lived have wept, have trembled, have longed for redemption. The mother who mourns her lost child feels not only her sorrow, but the sorrow of the archetypal mother, Demeter mourning Persephone, Isis mourning Osiris. The man betrayed by a friend experiences not only the sting of personal deception, but the universal drama of trust shattered Julius Caesar and Brutus. The brother betrayed by brother. In my own life, I have sat with many who mistook their pain for failure or defect. They carried the weight of suffering as if it were proof of unworthiness. But when I invited them to see their pain not as punishment, but as participation in the great unfolding story of humanity, something shifted. The burden became a bridge, the wound a doorway. To understand pain as archetypal is to lift oneself from the swamp of self-pity and enter the realm of meaning. It is to stand within a myth, not outside it. What happens to me, said the Stoic Epictetus, may not be within my power, but what I make of it is mine alone. If we can recognize our suffering as part of a deeper symbolic drama, we are no longer its victims, we become its interpreters, even its alchemists. And it is there, in that recognition, that the cycle of emotional pain begins to unravel, not because the pain vanishes, but because it finds its rightful place. In the eternal dance of the soul with the divine, no true transformation is possible without first enduring a kind of death. This death is not of the body, but of the identity we have so tightly clung to, the beliefs, the masks, the illusions we mistake for the self. Just as the seed must crack and fall into the darkness before the sprout can reach toward the sun, so too must the ego descend into the underworld before the soul can rise in its fuller radiance. I have seen many resist this death, mistaking it for failure or madness. Yet what they were encountering was the threshold of initiation. The ancients knew this well. The rites of Eleusis, the myths of Osiris, of Inanna, of Christ, they all speak of this sacred descent, this necessary disintegration of the false self before the emergence of something truer, more whole. The alchemists called it the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolving of form, the beginning of all transformation. Without it, there can be no gold. In my own descent, I once felt my mind unravel in the chaos of visions, and for a time I feared I would lose myself. But in that abyss, I discovered something ancient, something deeper than personality. I discovered the self not as an image, but as an unfolding force guiding me through the dissolution. It was not the end of me. It was the end of who I thought I was. A caterpillar does not become a butterfly. By growing wings, it must first surrender to the chrysalis, dissolve into formlessness, and allow something utterly new to emerge. So it is with us. We cannot cling to what must die and expect to be reborn. Whosoever will save his life shall lose it, said the sacred scripture, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. This is not a metaphor, it is a law of the soul. The old must die, not in violence, but in surrender, and only then can the deeper self rise, not in perfection, but in wholeness. And so I say to you, do not flee from your pain, for it is the very path through which your soul seeks to awaken. The suffering you carry is not a punishment, but a passage. The fire you endure is the forge of transformation. Each wound, each shadow, each shattered illusion is an invitation, an opening into a deeper truth that has long awaited your courage to be seen. What you call the end is often the beginning veiled in despair. There is no salvation in avoidance. There is no freedom in denial. To awaken is to descend into the very places you feared, and there to find the divine spark, hidden within the ashes of what you thought you were. You are not here to escape your humanity, but to sanctify it. Not to erase your past, but to integrate it. Not to seek perfection, but to embody wholeness. So I urge you, do not numb your pain. Do not silence your soul. Walk into the depths with reverence. Dare to feel, to face, to fall and rise anew. The light you seek will not come from without. It is waiting within. Now go and meet yourself there.